Sit down, Owen. This won't take long. I thought we were here to talk.
My lawyer drafted the papers. I need your signature.
Ember Trace is finished. You've known that for months. Brielle deserves a life that isn't built on excuses.
You actually thought this was gonna end differently?
I kept this family afloat longer than any of you want to remember.
That's a real nice story. Write it down someday.
Please, Owen. Just sign.
Fine. Good. You were never enough anyway.
That night I stood outside the Halston house with a suitcase and a signed separation agreement. They had called me a failure, and every word landed where they intended. I said almost nothing. There was nothing worth saying, or so they believed. What none of them noticed was the television behind them running the evening lottery broadcast. And there was something in my jacket pocket that I had already forgotten I was carrying. The question isn't whether they were wrong about me. The question is what it costs them when they finally find out how wrong. If you've ever been written off by someone who didn't see the full picture, stay with this story. It goes somewhere they never expected. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribing to this channel takes about 2 seconds. It means a lot. Now let's get into it. I built Ember Trace Technologies in a rented warehouse that smelled like motor oil and sawdust using tools I bought secondhand from a retired electrician in Loveland. The sensors I developed were designed to catch what human eyes couldn't: subtle shifts in heat, moisture gas composition, and the specific frequency of stressed timber before a fire takes hold. I'd drive out to mountain towns that couldn't afford the big contractors, climb communication towers alone to test equipment, and sleep in my installation truck when the drive back to Fort Collins was too long to justify. None of that bothered me. I knew exactly why I was doing it, and the reason had nothing to do with money. My mother was a volunteer firefighter who died in a wildfire outside Estes Park when I was 26. The investigation found that the warning system failed to alert crews until the fire had already crowned. She was 200 yards from the evacuation perimeter when it happened. I spent the next several years learning everything I could about early detection acoustic signatures of dry timber thermal drift patterns in low wind conditions, the precise combinations of atmospheric data that precede ignition. Ember Trace was never just a company. It was the only answer I had to a question that still kept me up some nights. Brielle understood that once. When we were first married, she used to bring coffee to the warehouse on weekend mornings and sit on an overturned crate while I worked. She never asked me to hurry up, never suggested I find something more stable. She said she fell in love with a man who knew what he was fighting for, and that meant something to her. I believed her because in those years, everything she did confirmed it. We weren't wealthy, but we were solid, and I thought that was enough. The Halston family had a different definition of solid. Brielle's father, Vernon, had made his money in real estate development before retiring to a large house in the Granite Hollow neighborhood with a landscaped lot and a 3-car garage. He measured men by the ease of their finances, not by how they'd built what they had or what they'd sacrificed to keep it, but by the visible, immediate comfort of the result. He was always cordial to me in the early years, in the way someone is cordial to a contractor. They're not sure they'll rehire. As Ember Trace struggled through its 3rd and 4th year without a major contract, the cordiality faded into something cooler. Brielle's mother. Sylvia never said anything openly unkind. Her method was subtler, mentioning a friend's daughter whose husband had just bought a second property, or noting that another couple had just returned from a cruise to the Mediterranean. She didn't need to say anything directly. The implication accumulated over years until it had the weight of a full argument. Her brother Chase was less careful. He'd borrowed money from me twice, once to cover rent, once to keep a business venture from collapsing, and both times he'd thanked me in the short term and treated me with visible condescension in the long term. I never called it in. I didn't think I needed to. The only person in that family who treated me like a person instead of a balance sheet was Brielle's cousin, Hadley Morse. Hadley was quieter than the others, watchful in a way that suggested she saw more than she let on. She never joined in when the conversation turned critical of me, though she rarely intervened either. I used to think of her as the neutral party, someone who wasn't for me or against me, just present. I understand now that neutrality has its own cost, and she understood that too, even if it took her a while to act on it. Everything changed when Frontier Basin Energy Cooperative came into the picture. They operated power transmission infrastructure across several mountain counties, and their grid ran through some of the highest fire-risk terrain in the state. Their engineers had been studying the Ember Trace system for nearly 8 months. When they reached out to discuss a contract, I drove to the meeting with 3 years of field data and a working prototype that had already outperformed every competitor they'd tested. The deal they proposed would install thousands of sensors along their transmission lines. It wasn't just the largest contract in Ember Trace's history, it was the kind of contract that would let us hire a full engineering team, build proper manufacturing capacity, and expand into the markets we'd been too underfunded to reach. I told Betrayal the night I got home from that meeting. She smiled, and for a moment I saw the version of her from the warehouse mornings. I thought we were turning a corner. I should have been more careful about what I was hoping for. 3 weeks before the signing date, a procurement officer at Frontier Basin was placed under federal investigation for accepting payments from a competing contractor. He had no connection to my contract. My deal had gone through a separate review process and had been evaluated on technical merit alone. But the cooperative's legal team froze every active contract pending an internal audit. It didn't matter that I was clean. What mattered was that the revenue I had planned around the revenue I had quietly structured the next 18 months of Ember Trace's operations to depend on disappeared overnight. The bank declined an emergency credit line. An investor I'd been cultivating for 2 years pulled out, citing uncertainty in the sector. Suppliers who had extended terms based on the expected contract started calling in balances. I sold my dedicated installation truck, the 4-wheel drive I'd used for mountain field work, the one with 100,000 miles of rough terrain on it, and used the cash to make payroll for 6 more weeks. I kept my older personal truck for daily use, leveraged other equipment as collateral, and took a bridge loan at terms I wouldn't have accepted under any other circumstances. I did all of it without touching our household savings because I had never used family money to fund Ember Trace, and I wasn't going to start. Betrayal stopped asking about the company around that time. I noticed it but didn't raise it, thinking she was giving me space. Then I came home one evening and found a notification on a joint account. A large transfer had been processed that morning to an account I didn't recognize. When I asked about it, she said she had moved the money to a personal account for security in case Ember Trace collapsed, and took everything with it. She said it matter-of-factly, as if she'd already thought it through and decided it was reasonable. I explained that I had never touched our personal savings for the business, that the two were entirely separate, that she had no reason to believe our household finances were at risk. She listened without interrupting. Then she said she understood, but she felt better with the money somewhere she controlled. That was the first time I understood that she had already begun making decisions about a future that didn't necessarily include me in it. The morning of the day, everything ended. I drove up to Juniper Pass to service a sensor array I'd installed 2 years earlier for a volunteer fire station. The station had run out of budget to maintain the contract, and I'd been servicing their equipment for free ever since. Midsummer was approaching, and the region was in its 2nd year of below-average snowpack. The timing mattered. I wasn't going to leave them unmonitored heading into fire season because the accounting didn't work out. I finished the service call around 4 in the afternoon and started the drive back to Fort Collins. On the way down the mountain, I stopped at a small convenience store called Pine Lantern Market to fill the tank and buy coffee for the road. The register was running low on coins, and the woman at the counter, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, apologized and offered me a $3 lottery ticket instead of the change she owed me. I almost waved it off. I think I said something about luck not being my strong suit lately. But she was already holding it out, and it seemed rude to decline, so I took it and tucked it into the inside pocket of my jacket without looking at it. I had other things on my mind. By the time I merged back onto the highway, I had forgotten it was there. Betrayal called while I was still 40 minutes out. She said her family was gathered at her parents' house, and she needed me to come over that evening. She used the phrase, "serious conversation about our future," which I recognized as language that had been prepared in advance. I told myself it might be a chance to reset, that maybe sitting down together, all of us, we could find a way forward. I had done that before, shown up, stayed calm, explained the situation with more patience than it probably deserved, and eventually brought the temperature down. I thought that was what I was driving toward. The house at Granite Hollow had its lights on in every room when I pulled up. Brielle's car was in the driveway, and so were Vernon's and Chase's. Inside the front hallway, arranged as if they'd been waiting, were Brielle, Vernon, Sylvia Chase, and Hadley. A suitcase, mine the gray one, sat next to the door. They had packed it without telling me it would be needed. Vernon spoke first. He laid out his position with the composure of someone who had rehearsed it. I had failed to provide stability. I had no realistic path to recovery, and Brielle had endured enough uncertainty. Sylvia added that her daughter had waited patiently for years and deserved a life she could count on. Chase, standing near the far wall with his phone angled toward me, said that Ember Trace had always been a fantasy dressed up as a business plan. He looked satisfied the way someone looks when they've been waiting a long time to say something out loud. I reminded Chase that the money from Ember Trace had covered his rent during the 14 months he couldn't keep a job and again when his first business venture went under. I said it without heat, just as a fact that deserved to be part of the conversation. He raised his phone slightly and kept it pointed at me, hoping, I think, for a reaction he could use later. I didn't give him one. Hadley was sitting in the chair near the window apart from the others. She didn't say anything. I noticed she had her phone face up in her lap. When Chase lifted his device and aimed it across the room, something shifted in Hadley's expression, a tightening around the eyes, a decision being made, and I saw her screen come to life in her hands. She didn't announce what she was doing. She just did it quietly, the way you do something when you're not sure yet whether it will matter, but you're not willing to risk that it won't. Then Brielle set a folder on the coffee table. She had spoken to an attorney. The separation agreement had been drafted, reviewed, and signed by her. All that remained was my signature. She slid it toward me and said she just needed me to make it official. I read through the documents. They were thorough. This had not been put together in a week. I understood then that the conversation I had imagined on the drive over, the one where we found a way through, had never been the plan. The plan was always this room, this folder, this moment. I asked her one question before I picked up the pen. I asked whether this was her decision or the decision of everyone in the room. She looked toward her father before she answered. Then she said she was choosing a future she could trust. I took that as the honest answer it was, and I signed. Vernon picked up the suitcase and set it outside the front door. Sylvia asked for my key to the house. I reached into my coat pocket and found it, and then I noticed something else in that pocket, the lottery ticket I'd forgotten about entirely. I left it where it was and pulled out only the key. I set the key on the porch railing, lifted the suitcase, and walked down the front steps into the snow that had been falling for the past hour. Behind me, I heard the door close and the deadbolt turn. What I felt in that moment wasn't rage. It wasn't even despair, not exactly. It was the particular flatness that comes when you realize something has been over for much longer than you knew, and that you've been the last person to understand it. I had believed we were in a hard season. I hadn't understood that she had already decided the season was permanent. I got to the end of the driveway before I remembered the one thing that wasn't in the suitcase. My mother had kept a field journal during her years as a volunteer firefighter, a cloth-covered notebook where she recorded conditions, crew decisions, and her own observations from every call she responded to. She'd written in it during the days before the fire that killed her. I kept it in a wooden box on the bedroom shelf, and I had never once left it somewhere I couldn't get it back. Brielle knew exactly what it meant to me. It was not in the suitcase. That was not an oversight. I stood at the end of the driveway for a moment with the snow coming down and the lights on inside the house and my name no longer on the key. I could go back and ask for it. I could ring the bell and explain that it wasn't mine to leave behind, that it had nothing to do with the money or the company or any of this. I thought about what it would look like, me standing at the door I'd just been locked out of, asking for something they knew I needed. I thought about Chase's phone still probably recording. I picked up the suitcase and kept walking. Somewhere in my jacket pocket in a fold of paper. I hadn't thought about since a gas station in the mountains $900 million was waiting for someone to check the numbers. Nobody in that house was going to be that person tonight. I slept in my personal truck that night in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner on the south side of Fort Collins. The heat ran until the tank dropped low enough to worry me, Then I shut it off and pulled my jacket tighter. The snow had stopped somewhere around midnight, and by 2 in the morning the windows had frosted over on the inside. I didn't sleep much. What kept me awake wasn't the cold. It was the specific quality of silence that comes after something ends, when the noise you were used to is gone, and you can't remember yet how to exist without it. I kept returning to the same moment, Betrayal looking toward her father, before she answered my question. One glance. Half a second. But it told me everything I hadn't wanted to know about where the decision had actually been made and how long ago. I had walked into that room believing we were in a crisis together. She had walked in knowing we were already on the other side of it. By 5:30, I gave up on sleep and drove to the Ember Trace office. The building was dark when I arrived. I made coffee in the break room and sat at my desk going through the numbers I already knew by memory. What we owed, what we had. How many weeks of payroll I could still cover without the Frontier Basin revenue. The arithmetic hadn't changed overnight. It was still the same wall I'd been staring at for weeks. Only now I was staring at it from a folding chair in an office rather than from a house that had my name on the mailbox. When the team arrived that morning, I asked them to gather before anyone started work. I stood in the center of the room and told them the truth without dressing it up. I told them I no longer had a place to live, that my marriage had ended the previous night, and that the company's financial position remained serious. I told them I would not be using any of their deferred wages to stabilize my personal situation, that every dollar that came in would go to payroll first, and that if anyone needed to find more stable work immediately, I would write them a reference that reflected exactly what they had contributed here. I said it because I thought they deserved honesty more than they deserved a performance of confidence I didn't feel. Nobody left. A few people looked at the floor. Mateo Ruiz, who had been with Ember Trace since the 2nd year, the man who'd helped me install the first commercial array and had once driven 4 hours through a snowstorm to fix a sensor failure before a prescribed burn, waited until the others had gone back to their stations. Then he came over and held out a key on a plain ring. He had a room above his family's machine shop on Larimer Street, he said. It wasn't much, but it had heat and a lock. He'd used it when his father was sick and he needed to be close to the shop without the drive. He wasn't using it now. I could stay as long as I needed. I tried to find the right words, and mostly failed. Mateo had worked for me through months when I couldn't offer raises through a stretch, when the health insurance lapsed for 6 weeks because I couldn't make the premium. He'd stayed through all of it, and now he was handing me a key. I understood in a way I hadn't fully registered before that loyalty isn't a statement people make. It's a pattern you only see clearly once enough time has passed. I was driving to the machine shop to drop off my bag when I heard it on the radio. A local news segment, the kind that runs between traffic reports. The anchor mentioned that the winning ticket for the previous night's $900 million jackpot had been purchased at a convenience store called Pine Lantern Market located on Route 14 heading down from the Poudre Canyon. They were still looking for the winner who hadn't come forward yet. I reached into my jacket pocket without thinking. The ticket was still there, folded in half, exactly where I'd put it the afternoon before. I pulled over and sat with the engine idling. I told myself it wasn't going to be anything. The odds of winning a jackpot of that size were roughly 1 in 300 million, and I was not a person to whom extraordinary things happened in the financial category. I looked at the ticket. Then I looked up the winning numbers on my phone. Then I looked at the ticket again. The first number matched. The second matched. I went through all 6 of them twice, then a third time using a different source to confirm the numbers. Every single digit corresponded. I sat there for a long time with the heater blowing and the radio still murmuring, and $900 million in my hand printed on a piece of paper the size of a bookmark that I had accepted as change from a gas station transaction because the register was short on quarters. The night before, when Vernon pushed my suitcase onto the porch and Betrayal looked toward her father before choosing her words, I had been holding this. I hadn't known. Not one of them had known. And the television in the living room, I remembered it now, playing silently in the background, while Vernon delivered his verdict, had been broadcasting the numbers as they were drawn. What I felt wasn't triumph. I want to be precise about that because the easier story is that I sat in that truck feeling vindicated, already imagining the look on their faces. That's not what happened. What I felt first was something close to vertigo, the particular dizziness of realizing that reality had been different from your understanding of it for the past several hours, and you're only now catching up. Then I thought about my mother's journal still on a shelf in a house I no longer had a key to. Then I thought about my employees sitting at their desks in a building I wasn't sure I could keep the lights on in. The money was real, but I had no idea yet what it meant, and I'd learned enough hard lessons to know that the moment right after something changes is the worst possible moment to make decisions. I called Iris Langford from the truck. Iris was an estate and asset attorney I had consulted twice before on Embertrace's structure, thorough, unflappable, and constitutionally opposed to imprecision. I told her what I was holding and asked her to meet me. She cleared her afternoon and told me to bring the ticket in a sealed envelope and not to tell anyone else until we'd spoken. When I sat down across from her desk an hour later, the first thing she asked about was the separation agreement. I told her Betrayal had signed it before I left for Juniper Pass that morning, and that I'd signed it at the house the previous evening. Iris typed the timeline into her notes without any visible reaction, then looked up and explained what that meant in plain language. The ticket had been purchased after the legal separation was initiated, which placed it entirely outside the scope of marital property. $900 million belonged to me alone, and nothing about what had happened the previous night created any legal claim on it. She told me to keep the ticket secure, keep the discovery private, and make no significant decisions for at least 2 weeks. She also told me that once this became public, people would come back. She said it without drama, as a professional observation. People who had removed themselves from my life would reappear, and my only job would be learning to distinguish genuine regret from regret about a missed opportunity. I told her I understood. I wasn't sure I fully did yet, but I was willing to try. The weeks that followed were strange in a way I hadn't anticipated. I went to the office every day, ate most of my meals at the diner near the machine shop, and worked through the logistics of Embertrace's recovery in the same incremental way I'd always operated, one problem at a time in order of urgency. The difference was that now I could actually solve them. I paid the outstanding payroll balances in full. I settled the accounts with every supplier who had been waiting. The bridge loan was cleared. I purchased the warehouse at Forge Creek outright, which meant Embertrace was no longer one landlord's decision away from losing its primary workspace. I did all of it through the trust structure Iris set up, moving carefully enough that nothing triggered attention before I was ready. Betrayal and her family continued to believe I was living above a machine shop and managing a company that was weeks from folding. I didn't correct that impression. Not out of strategy exactly, I simply had nothing to say to any of them that I hadn't already said. The Frontier Basin situation resolved itself during that same period. The federal investigation concluded the procurement officer was indicted, and the cooperative's legal review determined that every contract unrelated to the compromised official would be reinstated. An attorney from their team called me directly to confirm that the Embertrace agreement was clean and they wanted to move forward. When I sat down at that second negotiation, everything was different. I wasn't coming to the table as a founder who needed this deal to survive. I was coming as someone who had already survived. That shift, small on the surface, total in practice, changed every conversation we had. We signed within a week. I established the Calder Fire Shield Foundation during the same period, working with Iris and a nonprofit attorney to structure it properly before any public announcement. The mission was narrow by design, fund early detection equipment for the communities that needed it most and could afford it least. Mountain schools, volunteer fire stations, low-income neighborhoods in high-risk zones, senior care facilities in areas where a fast-moving fire could mean no time to evacuate. I also built in a component that I told no one was personal, a temporary housing program for firefighters, field technicians, and other essential workers who found themselves without a place to live due to disaster or financial collapse. I didn't explain to anyone where that particular idea had come from. It wasn't a secret exactly. It was just mine. I thought I was ready when Iris finally recommended we go public. A local radio station had been investigating the Pine Lantern market angle for days. They'd narrowed the window of likely purchasers based on loyalty card data and transaction records, and she told me it was only a matter of time before someone connected my name to the timeline. If that happened before I controlled the story, I would lose the ability to shape what the first public account said about me and about Embertrace. Better to step forward on my terms than to be found. I agreed to an appearance at Centennial Broadcast Center, a live interview with enough reach to establish the facts before any other version took hold. I dressed the same way I always did. I drove myself there. I sat in the green room and thought about the volunteer station at Juniper Pass, about the sensor array. I'd serviced the morning before everything changed about Darlene Pike, who ran that station, and had thanked me with a handshake and a thermos of coffee because it was all she had to offer. When I walked onto the set, and they introduced me to the audience as the winner of the $900 million jackpot, I watched the host's face arrange itself into the expression people use when they're talking to someone extraordinary. I didn't feel extraordinary. I felt like a man who had been cold in a parking lot 3 weeks ago and had been given a room by someone who remembered how I'd treated him when I had nothing to give. In the interview, I talked about Embertrace. I talked about the foundation and the communities it would serve. When I described the emergency housing program for people who lost their homes suddenly without warning through no fault of their own, I kept my voice even. Somewhere I knew there was a television in a house in Granite Hollow. I didn't have to wait long to find out what effect it had. My phone registered the first calls while I was still in the building. Betrayal, then Sylvia, then a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be Vernon calling from his landline. There were messages, careful, considered messages that had clearly been composed and revised before sending. Betrayal said she wanted to talk, that she understood this was complicated, and that she hoped I would give her a chance to explain. Sylvia's was longer and somewhat less coherent. Vernon's message described the previous weeks as a misunderstanding between people under pressure and suggested we find time to sit down as a family. Chase did not call. Chase posted. He uploaded the video he had recorded that night in the living room, but not all of it. What appeared online was a clip that began roughly 3 minutes into the confrontation after everything that preceded it had been cut away. Chase posted, the viewer saw a man standing in a family's living room, expression closed, speaking in a low voice. The visible context, no suitcase, no separation papers on the table, no record of what had been said before the camera started, made the scene look like an argument initiated by the man in the frame. Chase's caption described a husband who had abandoned his wife immediately after learning he'd won, who had hidden the lottery windfall, and walked away from a woman who had stood by him through years of difficulty. The clip spread faster than I would have believed possible. By the following morning, the comment sections on every article about my win had divided into 2 camps. A significant portion of the public had absorbed Chase's version as the true one, and they were vocal about it. Several of the organizations Iris had been cultivating as foundation partners sent careful emails asking for clarification before they moved forward. 2 of Embertrace's prospective clients mentioned the controversy in the same breath as our contract discussions. I had $900 million, a reinstated contract with Frontier Basin, and a foundation built to protect vulnerable communities, and I was watching it all develop a crack because Chase had a phone and no conscience and the good sense to post something before anyone could contradict it. Betrayal saw the clip. She called me again the night it went up. I didn't answer. What I was waiting to see, what I needed to know before I decided anything, was whether she would say something publicly. Whether when it mattered she would choose the truth over the easier silence. I waited for 2 days. She said nothing. That silence was its own answer. And it was, I realized, the same answer she had given in the living room on the night of the snow when she looked toward her father before she spoke. She knew what the right thing was. She simply couldn't make herself do it when it cost her something. I had lost everything once because I didn't have money. Now I had more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, and I was watching the same people use a different method to try to take something from me again. The thing they were reaching for this time wasn't financial. It was the version of my story that the world would believe. And for the first time since I'd checked those numbers on the side of the road, I understood exactly what kind of fight I was actually in. Iris arranged the meeting at her office on a Wednesday morning. It was her suggestion, not mine. Neutral ground, a conference room with a rectangular table and no furniture that belonged to anyone's family. When I arrived, they were already there. Betrayal sat on one side of the table with Vernon to her left and Sylvia beside him. Chase took the chair at the far end slightly back from the table, as if reserving the option to claim he wasn't fully part of whatever was about to happen. Hadley sat apart from the others near the window, her hands folded in her lap. On the table in front of Betrayal was a wooden box I recognized before I'd fully registered anything else in the room. My mother's field journal. The cloth cover, the small brass clasp, the water stain on the lower right corner from a season in the mountains. Betrayal had her hands resting near it, but not on it the way someone positions themselves near an object they've been carrying for a long time and are not quite ready to release. I sat down across from her and waited. She told me she had kept the journal after the night I left. She said she had taken it out of the bedroom before the meeting and held on to it because she thought she believed that if I needed to come back for it, I would have to speak to her. She could hear, even as she was saying it, how that sounded. She said it anyway because she had apparently decided that honesty was the only currency she had left that might mean anything. I listened to her explain it without interrupting. When she finished, what I felt wasn't the anger I might have expected. It was something quieter and more final, the specific grief of learning that someone had understood exactly what mattered to you and had chosen to use that knowledge as leverage. Betrayal said she was sorry. She said she had acted from fear that her father had spent months convincing her the company's collapse was inevitable and that staying meant drowning alongside it. She said she knew that wasn't an excuse. Then she said she still loved me, and that if there was any version of a conversation where I could consider starting again, she wanted to have it. I let a moment settle before I answered her. I told her I thought her apology was at least partly sincere, and I meant that I was not trying to be cruel with the qualification. But I also told her that sincerity and trustworthiness are not the same thing, and that the night in that living room had shown me something I couldn't unsee. She had looked toward her father before answering my question. 1 second. 1 glance. And in it was the entire structure of where her loyalty actually lived when it was tested. That wasn't something an apology could overwrite. Vernon leaned forward at that point. He said that families go through difficult periods and that reasonable people found their way back to each other. His tone was the same measured executive tone he had used the night he pushed my suitcase onto the porch, authoritative, accustomed to being the one who determined when a conversation was over. Sylvia added that Betrayal had been a devoted partner for nearly 10 years and deserved to be part of the life ahead of me. I noticed that neither of them said they were wrong. They said the situation was regrettable, that tensions had been high, that words had been spoken in stress. But wrong, directly, personally wrong in what they had done, that word did not appear. Chase said he wanted to talk about the video. He described what happened as things getting away from him, the algorithm taking a post further than he intended, the nature of social media being unpredictable. He said he thought it would be reasonable, given the circumstances, for everyone to move forward without legal escalation. His voice was steady, but I had seen him hold a phone up and angle it at me, hoping I would give him something he could use. I knew the difference between a person who had made a mistake and a person who was negotiating the consequences of a decision they'd made deliberately. Chase was doing the second thing. Then Hadley stood up. She had been so still through the first part of the meeting that the room had almost absorbed her into the background. She stood with her hands at her sides and addressed everyone at the table, including her own family, with the measured precision of someone who had been deciding what to say for a long time and had finally arrived at the moment. She told us that on the night I was asked to leave the house at Granite Hollow, she had recorded the full conversation on her phone. She said that when Chase raised his device across the room and pointed it at me, something in her decided she wasn't going to let him be the only one with a record of what happened in that house. She had opened her own camera quietly without announcement and let it run. Her recording captured everything. Vernon's opening statement, Chase's comments about Ember Trace, the moment I reminded Chase about the money that had covered his debts, the sound of his voice as he kept his phone trained on me. It captured Betrayal presenting the separation agreement and my signature on the documents. And visible in the background throughout the second half of the recording on the television in the living room that no one had thought to watch was the lottery broadcast. The timestamp on Hadley's file showed the recording had begun before the results were announced. The numbers appeared on screen while we were all still in that room, while I was still signing papers and listening to Vernon explain why I wasn't enough. The recording also confirmed what Iris had already established legally, But what the public didn't know, the separation agreement had been signed before I ever walked through that door. I had not won the money and then abandoned Betrayal. The legal record of our separation existed before the ticket existed. Chase's video had implied a sequence that was factually impossible, and Hadley's recording could prove it. I looked at Hadley for a moment across the table. She met my eyes steadily and then looked at her hands. She was not performing courage. She was doing something harder. She was sitting in a room with her family and telling the truth at a cost she had clearly already calculated and accepted. I thanked her. I told her that what she'd done required something that most people in that room, including me, at various points had struggled with. I also told her gently but directly that silence in the face of something wrong has a way of extending the life of the wrong, and that I thought she understood that now in a way she hadn't fully before. She nodded once, and that was enough. Chase said nothing. He pulled his chair back another inch from the table. I told the room that I would not be using Hadley's recording to construct a public campaign against anyone in that family. I was not interested in destroying Vernon's business reputation or engineering some moment where Chase faced a crowd of strangers condemning him on camera. That kind of outcome would require me to dedicate energy to their humiliation, and I had already decided that I wasn't going to let what they had done determine who I became. What I was going to do was release the full factual record, the timeline, the legal documents, Hadley's footage through Iris, in the form of a verified statement so that the public account of what had happened would be accurate. That was not mercy extended to them. It was a boundary I was drawing for myself. Iris released the statement the following morning, accompanied by the documentation and a short excerpt from Hadley's video that showed the television broadcast visible in the background of the living room. The correction moved faster than I expected. By afternoon, the comment sections had shifted. By the following day, several journalists who had run with Chase's version had published corrections, some of them with more candor than I'd anticipated. The Foundation partners who had sent cautious emails all responded within 48 hours. The Ember Trace clients who'd raised the controversy dropped it without further discussion. Mateo sent a message to the entire staff the morning the statement went out. I found out about it later because he hadn't told me he was going to do it, telling the team the facts plainly, and noting that he had worked alongside me since the early years and that nothing in the public record surprised him because nothing in it was inconsistent with the man he had watched run this company. I read that message sitting in the room above the machine shop and felt something I didn't have a precise word for, the particular unexpected weight of being known accurately by someone who had no obligation to say so. Darlene Pike, who ran the volunteer station at Juniper Pass, gave a short interview to a regional outlet. She said that the Ember Trace system I'd serviced for free that afternoon. The afternoon of the day before everything went public had already logged 3 significant thermal anomalies over the past 2 fire seasons, each one triggering an alert early enough to allow preemptive resource deployment. She said I had shown up with my own tools and asked for nothing in return, and that the families living in that valley should probably know that the man the internet was currently arguing about had already been protecting them before he knew he had $900 million to work with. That interview, more than the legal documentation, more than the corrected timeline, was what settled the public conversation. Not because of what it said about me, but because of what it said about what I had been doing before any of this happened. I had one more conversation with Betrayal a week after the meeting at Iris's office. She asked me to come to a coffee shop on the north side of town, somewhere that wasn't her parents' neighborhood and wasn't anywhere we'd ever been together as a couple. I went. She looked tired and composed in the specific way that comes after you've done a great deal of crying and have decided to stop. She said she wasn't there to try again. She just wanted to say something that wasn't in any room full of other people. She said she had known that night that what they were doing was wrong. Not wrong in the sense that the situation was complicated or that she had mixed feelings. Wrong in the flat, simple sense of the word. And she had let it happen because the alternative meant standing in front of her father and saying that she disagreed with him, and she had spent her entire adult life avoiding that specific moment. She wasn't asking me to forgive the decision. She was telling me she understood what it had cost, and that the understanding wasn't something she was going to be able to put down. I told her I believed she meant that. I also told her that there was a difference between forgiving someone and rebuilding something with them. and that the distance between those two things in this case was not something I was willing to close. I wished her well, and I meant that too, not in the hollow way people say it when they mean the opposite. I genuinely did not want her to spend the rest of her life in the weight of that night. I wanted her to learn whatever it had to teach her and carry it into something better. But that something better was not going to include me. I looked around the coffee shop before I stood up the ordinary Tuesday morning of it, people with laptops and cups and ordinary problems, and then I looked back at her. "You didn't lose me when I got rich," I said. "You lost me when you showed me who you were." Then I left. The foundation's first full installation was at Juniper Ridge Elementary School at the edge of a valley that sat in the path of the same weather patterns that had caused 3 significant fire events in the previous decade. I stood on the hillside above the school on the morning the system went live and watched a group of 3rd graders practice an evacuation drill with the focused seriousness of children who have been told this matters. Volunteer firefighters moved through the perimeter checking the sensor mounts on the utility poles. Families from the surrounding neighborhood stood in a cluster near the access road watching. Mateo became Ember Trace's chief operating officer 6 months after the Frontier Basin contract was signed properly this time with full legal clearance and a ceremony that involved considerably better coffee than anything from the diner on the south side of town where I'd spent that first sleepless night. The engineers who had stayed through the hardest stretch received equity in the company. None of them had asked for it. That was why they were the right people to have it. I moved out of the room above the machine shop and into a house outside Fort Collins with a view of the foothills and enough land to feel the wind when it shifted. On clear nights, I could see the ridgeline above Juniper Pass from the porch. I thought about that sometimes, the sensor array up there running its quiet measurements, logging the data that might give someone's family 1 more hour. On the morning of the Juniper Ridge installation, I brought my mother's journal with me. I opened it to the last entry she wrote a few days before the fire. Her handwriting in that period was smaller and more compressed than in earlier years, as if she was trying to get more onto each page. In that final entry, she had written that a firefighter cannot decide where the fire begins, but can decide what they carry into it. She had meant it practically what equipment to prioritize, what to leave behind, when speed mattered more than weight. But she had also meant it the other way, and she had known that too when she wrote it. I stood on that hillside and understood that I had done what she was describing. The night I walked out into the snow with a suitcase and nothing else, I had carried the same things I had always carried, a belief that the work was worth doing and a decision not to become something smaller in response to people who had treated me as if I already was. The money hadn't created that. It had only given it room to operate. The children finished their drill and went back inside, chattering and slightly breathless in the way of children who have practiced something serious and feel good about how it went. The firefighters ran their final checks. A woman from the neighborhood came over and asked if I was the one who had set this up. I said yes. She said thank you in a way that did not require anything further, and I said you're welcome in the same way, and that was the whole conversation. It was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. If there's anything this story is really about, it's this. The people who matter most aren't the ones who show up when things are going well. They're the ones who hand you a key when you have nowhere to sleep, who stay at their desks when the company might not make payroll, who quietly point a camera at the truth when everyone else is looking the other way. Hold on to those people. And if you've ever been told you weren't enough by someone who just wasn't paying close enough attention, keep going. The work you do in the dark has a way of speaking for itself when the light comes on. If this story meant something to you, consider subscribing to this channel. There are more stories here about people who kept building when the ground fell out from under them, and what happened when the world finally caught up to what they had quietly been doing all along. We'd love to have you with us for the next one.